So as we talked about in the last video, right, the idea behind rhinoceros is definitely a more focused idea, right? In the Bald Soprano, what we saw was this crazy sort of introduction to how does language work? How do sentences go with one another? How fragile is this connection between language and meaning and being able to communicate with each other, and where can it all fall apart? And we see many, many places where it can fall apart. In rhinoceros, I think we have a similar idea behind what we do in society, right? That if it's language that can easily fall apart and can easily turn into sort of a disaster, in the Bald Soprano, it's society and society's cohesion and the idea of how we relate to each other that can fall apart easily in rhinoceros. What we know about rhinoceros is that the play itself is definitely a depiction of how fascism, how Nazi ideologies, how extremism of many sorts can take hold in a society and turn it into a kind of a mess, right? That people will not be able to easily decide how they want to proceed when it comes to ideologies, when it comes to extremist views, when it comes to deciding how you're going to respond to those ideologies and extremist views. We don't know how we're going to react until they happen, until we are confronted with them. And that if these things happen quite suddenly, that maybe we find ourselves in a position where we're really completely uncertain because we've never had time to think about how we would react. And if those ideologies have been creeping in slowly, we may never see ourselves having slipped into something where we've gone from being a fairly normal, rule-following, rule-abiding person, and as the rules erode, suddenly one day we realize we are completely and totally over the lines that once we said we were never going to cross, right? And so when we look at our characters, we've got Jean. We've got. It depends on what one you're watching. We've got Stanley, right, or Berenger, right, depending on which one is the play, which one is the movie. We've got Daisy, right. Those three being sort of our most important and our most fundamental characters, right. We do also have a couple of other characters we will talk about in another video, but let's start with Berenger or Stanley, right? And we're going to kind of stick at this point in time. Let's just agree that Berenger is going to be the one that we refer to, even in the movie, right? We'll still refer to Stanley as Berenger, right? But that Jean as well, right? And then Daisy. How are these three characters interacting with each other, and how do they perceive society? So we begin the film with Jean, and with his approaching Berenger in a cafe, and the confrontation between the two of them sets them off at very diametrically opposed sides of the spectrum. Jean is well-spoken, he's well-dressed, he seems to be in control of himself, he doesn't drink too much, he is really kind of an unpleasant person because, right, he feels himself morally and physically superior to Stanley, to Berenger, right? Berenger, on the other hand, right, is a drunk. He doesn't seem to feel very comfortable with his life. He is, late all the time. He's slovenly. We see the two of them sort of as opposed to each other. They are apparently friends, but Berenger says, in many cases, right, that Jean is very hard on him, and he understands, but that Jean cannot understand how difficult it is for him to be alive. So what do these two want? Well, Jean wants a life that is regulated, that makes sense, that allows people to dress well, that allows people to eat well, that keeps people from excesses. He wants a nice, regulated, organized life that is easy to live. Berenger, on the other hand, seems to be going through an existential crisis. Who is he? What is his job? He can't get used to himself. He can't get used to who he is, what he's like. He just doesn't understand how to be himself and feels like he's not himself in most of the cases. And so he wants to find out, who is he? Who is he? What does he believe? What does he do? When we meet Daisy, Daisy is an unusual character, right? In the film, we see her as sort of the ditzy, pie-in-the-sky person who really is willing to do anything, who is sort of, not really worried about anything, who has seen a rhinoceros but isn't that terribly concerned about it, and seems to be somewhat in love with Berenger, but also not really in love with anything, right? Sort of willing to let anything go. And through the first half of this play, we see everybody having to confront this menace, right? This menace of people turning into rhinoceros and deciding what is their response going to be to this entire thing. We've neatly divided this play up into really 4 different sections. We have a section with Stanley, Berenger, and the logic people right at the cafe at the very beginning. We then see Berenger and Daisy in the office together with their workmates. Then we see, right, Berenger confronting Jean at his house, his apartment, and we see that, Jean ends up turning into a rhinoceros. And then the very last section is sort of the end scene where Berenger has barricaded himself in his house. Finally, other people come over. He basically has to hash out the way that he feels and ends up at the very end of the play having to decide, is he going to become a rhinoceros or not, because he's the only one left. So our first 2 sections are going to be really the work of this week, and deciding sort of how people feel about the rhinoceros and what their ideas are going to be regarding them. We see right away the different reaction of Jean and Berenger to the rhinoceros. Let's talk about that in the next video.